In the spring of the year 1644, the Emperor of China hiked up a hill just north of the Forbidden City in Beijing. As he reached the summit of Prospect Hill, he had a clear view of the imperial city beneath him. But on this day, his gaze would have been fixed on the smoke and fire that rose up from distant quarters of the capital. It was April 24th, and all that smoke and fire was the handiwork of peasant rebels who were about to breach the walls of the Forbidden City. Zhu Youjian, the 17th and soon-to-be last emperor of the Ming Dynasty, climbed back down the hill and gathered the women of his harem around him. Unwilling to let any of them be captured alive, Zhu made a clumsy attempt to slice them to death. Having failed to kill his family, the emperor then climbed back up the hill and hung himself from the rafters of the Pavilion of Imperial Longevity. It was an ironic place for an emperor to die, much less witness the end of an entire dynasty. Surprisingly, though, this would not be the last time that Prospect Hill would serve as the backdrop for a dramatic fall from political grace. On October 6, 1976, more than 3 centuries later, Jiang Qing, the widow of communist revolutionary Mao Zedong, decided to spend the day picking fruit on Prospect Hill when she was arrested and put on trial for her role in the Cultural Revolution. If it was any solace, both Jiang Qing and Zhu Youjian enjoyed the best view in all of Beijing before the end came, and it is a vantage point still enjoyed by millions of exhausted tourists who make the hike up Prospect Hill each year. From the summit, you can see the defining features of the Forbidden City below, a series of rectangular walled enclosures laid out on a north-south axis, all surrounded by a moat that is 13 feet deep and 175 feet across. Spread out over 178 acres are more than 100 buildings containing some 900 rooms, nearly all of which conform to a standard exterior color scheme. Gray cobblestone courtyards, vermilion walls, and golden tiled roofs. Now, it's easy to get lured into complacency by the architectural uniformity of the Forbidden City. Many visitors, including myself many years ago, come away from their visit a little disappointed. At first and second glance, the buildings all look superficially alike, and the rich history behind them can be overwhelming for the casual tourist to digest. Unlike other great monuments or natural wonders that wear their beauty and history on their sleeves, the Forbidden City doesn't express its majesty by reaching for the stars. Its halls and palaces aren't larger than life, so you won't feel like an ant walking through its courtyards and gateways. Instead, the architects of the Forbidden City pursued a vision in which Chinese models of cultural harmony are endlessly replicated, with the goal of placing the emperor at the center of the cosmos, between heaven and earth. According to Liang Sicheng, a prominent Chinese architect, quote, "The individual buildings, especially from a structural view, are unremarkable. But as a composition of the grand plan, there is nothing comparable to it in the world. It is a grand plan on the grandest scale." It's also really old. In fact, the Forbidden City just celebrated its 600-year anniversary in the year 2020. A remarkable feat for densely packed wooden structures. Though, as you might expect, many of them have burned down and been rebuilt multiple times. In 1987, in recognition of its status as the preeminent architectural symbol of Imperial China, the Forbidden City was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. With such great milestones come great expectations. And our goal for this lecture is to chart a unique path through the Forbidden City, one that allows us to appreciate its complex history and design on a more intimate scale. But first, let's orient ourselves geographically. There are 2 major rivers in China, the Yellow River in the north and the Yangtze River in the south. In more than 3,000 years of recorded history in China, the capital of every single significant empire has been based somewhere near the Yellow River in the north, even after the majority of the population migrated south to the Yangtze River Delta during the first millennium AD. There's a simple reason for this. The generally flat terrain of northern China is what some historians call an exposed zone. Exposed to what? Well, the nomads of Inner Asia. In fact, most Chinese dynasties weren't nearly as Chinese as you might think. Roughly half the time, China was ruled wholly or in part by northern nomadic peoples such as the Mongols and the Manchus, who used their military advantages on horseback to roam over vast distances and conquer the fertile agricultural regions to the south. It is also why many dynasties in China kept trying to build imposing walls along their northern peripheries to provide a man-made barrier where the terrain had not provided a natural barrier. So the capitals of major dynasties in China tended to be based in the north. This is because Chinese dynasties needed to keep a close watch on the northern frontier, while conquering nomads wanted to retain close ties to their homeland. But why Beijing specifically? After all, the founder of the Ming dynasty, Zhu Yanzhang, had decreed that the capital should be in Nanjing, in the south. But when the emperor died in the year 1398, his fourth son, Zhu Di, contested the succession and seized the throne from his nephew. Significantly, Zhu Di's base of power was in Beijing, where his father had ordered him to keep a vigilant watch over the Mongol threat. Now emperor, Zhu Di embarked on an ambitious program to erase all memory of the old capital in Nanjing, as well as his own bloody ascent to power. To seal the deal, he commissioned a new palace in the new capital, the Forbidden City. Completed in the year 1420, the Forbidden City served as the primary residence for 24 emperors over 2 different dynasties. For more than 500 years, it was the backdrop for imperial ceremonies and rituals, palace intrigue, and the routine business of government. But don't be fooled by its impressive moat or its forbidding walls, for the Forbidden City was no fortress. In fact, over the course of its lengthy history, the Forbidden City has been broached by invading armies on numerous occasions. The most important one occurred in 1644, when Manchu armies from the north took advantage of the suicide of the last Ming emperor to establish their own dynasty, the Qing. This means that the history of the Forbidden City is split almost evenly between 2 very different types of dynasties. A Chinese one with ancestral roots in the south, and a Manchu one with ancestral roots in the Inner Asian steppe to the north. And we will see this change in leadership reflected in the evolving function of many of the buildings inside the Forbidden City. It is also reflected in its plaques and signs, with many important inscriptions written in both Chinese and Manchu. And the Ming-Qing transition of 1644 was by no means the last assault on the gates of the Forbidden City. As we hike down Prospect Hill and cross the moat from the north, we find ourselves face to face with the Gate of Divine Prowess. It was here, during the turbulent decade known as the Cultural Revolution, that several groups of young Red Guards responded to Chairman Mao's call to, quote, bombard the headquarters of the Chinese Communist Party. One particularly zealous group of teenagers attempted to ram through the Gate of Divine Prowess with a truck. When that failed, they decided to hoist a banner over the gate that read, Palace of Blood and Tears. A few Red Guards did manage to make it inside, where they subjected resident staff to struggle sessions and replaced old plaques with Mao portraits and quotes from his Little Red Book. But once we pass through the Gate of Divine Prowess, all that recent upheaval is quickly forgotten, for we have entered the Imperial Garden. Sharing space with the garden is a Taoist temple with a statue of a powerful god inside. This is the Hall of Imperial Peace. Together, this garden and its Taoist temple represent some of the quintessential elements of Chinese culture. Taoism, for instance, is China's only major indigenous religion, with a focus on achieving harmony with the natural world and learning how to harness its mysterious powers for the pursuit of health and longevity. In the attics of several buildings in the Forbidden City, for instance, we find evidence of Taoist rituals intended to neutralize the ever-present threat of fire. These include tablets inscribed with the names of various Taoist deities, along with a rare fungus, the Lingjur mushroom, which was believed to aid the pursuit of immortality when ingested. The Imperial Garden was also inspired by interactions between the Chinese and nature, particularly when millions fled the war-torn and overpopulated lands of the Yellow River Valley during the second half of the first millennium and took refuge in the south. Instead of the arid plains and dusty plateaus of the north, Chinese migrants to the south found a humid wonderland of lakes, rivers, mountains, wetlands, and tropical flora. Wealthy landlords and officials began to demonstrate their knowledge and appreciation of this unfamiliar landscape by recreating it in enclosed artificial gardens. Similarly, the Imperial Garden in the Forbidden City is filled with imitation hills, miniature streams, manicured plants, elegant kiosks, and pavilions. The perfect place for cultivated gentlemen to drink tea, write poetry, and reflect on man's place in the cosmos. Other elements of the Forbidden City also draw upon the philosophical and cultural foundations of Chinese civilization. The most obvious is in the very name of the palace itself. Zijincheng literally means the forbidden walled city of the pole star. This is a reference to the ancient ideal of a virtuous monarch. According to the 6th century BC philosopher Confucius, a virtuous monarch is like the pole star, which remains constant as all the other celestial bodies revolve around it. Then we also have the concept of Feng Shui, or the harmonious alignment of man with the latent powers of nature as embodied in the landscape. In fact, Feng Shui is directly responsible for the construction of Prospect Hill, where we started our tour. That's right, I said construction. For Prospect Hill is an artificial mound that is composed of the dirt and rock dug up from the moat. According to the guiding precepts of Feng Shui, a man-made structure such as the Forbidden City will only be safe if it has water in front and a protective mountain behind it. Prospect Hill is that mountain, while an artificial canal known as the River of Golden Waters in the southernmost courtyard provides the water. From the Imperial Garden, let's exit to the southwest and make our way through what is known as the Inner Court. Now, the fundamental spatial division in the Forbidden City is between the inner and the outer court. The outer court is more or less the southern half of the precinct, while the inner court covers most of the northern half. The chief difference between the two lies not in appearance, but rather in scale and function. The halls of the outer court are much more grandiose and imposing, with vast courtyards surrounding them on all sides. But no one lived in the outer court, and women were a rare sight there. This is because the outer court served as the backdrop for most of the formal rituals and imperial audiences of the empire, as we'll see when we reach the southern half of the Forbidden City. The inner court in the northern half, however, was much more intimate and personalized. Here, among narrow walkways, tiny courtyards, private gardens, and even multi-story opera theaters, lived the emperor, his women, and an army of eunuchs to serve them. As we stroll through the dense living quarters of the northwestern section of the inner court, we'll catch a glimpse of the western 6 palaces. Along with the eastern 6 palaces, these residences would have served as the homes of high-ranking consorts and empress dowagers. There were 8 ranks of imperial consorts, and these ranks determined every aspect of their lives in the Forbidden City. The size of their residence, their number of servants, the quality of their food, and many other markers of status. Most exalted of all, however, were the empress dowagers, who were either mothers or widows of emperors. They outranked even the emperor himself, who kowtowed only to her and to heaven. The Palace of Compassion and Tranquility, just southwest of the western 6 palaces, was home to one of these powerful women in the middle of the 17th century. Her name was Boombatai, and she was the Mongol consort of the founding emperor of the Qing dynasty. As the mother of the second emperor and grandmother of the third, she wielded enormous influence at court. But in a deeply patriarchal society, this power had to be exercised in subtle ways. So Boombatai, like most imperial women in a position of influence, chose to funnel her resources into religious patronage. For instance, she transformed the building just behind the Palace of Compassion and Tranquility into a great Buddha hall, and it remained a center of Buddhist worship for centuries after her death. In addition to Chinese Buddhism, the architecture of the inner court also found room to accommodate the worship of Tibetan Buddhism. In a courtyard just north of the Palace of Compassion and Tranquility is the Pavilion of Rain and Flowers. Now the most complete Tibetan tantric temple in China, the Pavilion of Rain and Flowers can be identified by its distinctive bronze roof. Though the Ming imperial court was an eager patron of Tibetan Buddhism, they were unable to extend their political influence into Tibet. But the Pavilion of Rain and Flowers did serve as a religious symbol of Chinese imperial ambition to control Tibet, an ambition that was largely realized in the 20th century. Now, so far, we've visited 3 of the most important religious shrines in the Forbidden City. But there are some 26 of them in all, each one filled with incense, candles, and incantations. Perhaps the most unique religious monument, however, was a building that was never intended to serve a religious function. To get there, let's head back through the western 6 palaces to a large courtyard just south of the Imperial Garden. This courtyard contains the 3 rear palaces, which mirror on a smaller scale the 3 grand halls of the outer court to the south. The furthest north of the 3 rear palaces is the Palace of Earthly Tranquility. During the Ming Dynasty, this palace was the primary residence of the empress. But under the Qing, it was transformed into a space for worshipping the unique Manchu gods of the royal family. From the late 17th century onward, it would have been adorned with bows, quivers, and drums. Not only that, it would have been staffed by Manchu shamans who ritually roasted a boar in specially made pits. But you need to be careful when roasting boars in the Forbidden City. The Palace of Earthly Tranquility burnt down and had to be rebuilt a total of 4 times. Now let's head to the next building in this courtyard, the Hall of Union. A small square structure, the Hall of Union was where the empress and top consorts assembled once every year to perform the rites of sericulture, or silk production. This was the feminine counterpart to the masculine rites of rice agriculture. And as usual, the activities undertaken by women are confined to the inner court. So, what about the men? Well, the only real man who could live in the inner court was the emperor himself. He was, of course, attended by thousands of eunuchs who also spent their days and nights throughout the Forbidden City. In fact, historians estimate that the Ming court employed as many as 20,000 eunuchs. The Qing, who overthrew the Ming and regarded eunuch interference in politics as one of their downfalls, reduced the number of eunuchs to 1/10 that of their predecessor. And as for the Son of Heaven himself, the first 13 emperors of the Ming dynasty lived just south of the Hall of Union, in the Hall of Heavenly Purity. Then, early in the morning on November 27th, 1542, more than a dozen women succeeded in tying up the sadistic Youngjung Emperor and attempted to strangle him. They failed and suffered the ultimate punishment, Lingchi, also known as the death of 1,000 cuts. The emperor, badly shaken, vowed never to sleep in the Hall of Heavenly Purity again, but it was still used for some formal ceremonies involving the emperor. Perhaps the most famous was that of the Youngjung Emperor, who reigned in the middle of the 18th century. In an attempt to prevent endless scheming over the succession process, the Youngjung Emperor wrote down the name of his chosen heir on 2 separate pieces of paper. One was kept on his own person, and the other was hidden in the Hall of Heavenly Purity. So if Ming and Qing emperors no longer felt safe in the Hall of Heavenly Purity, where did they live? For the answer, let's head southwest to the adjacent Hall of Mental Cultivation. A small, underwhelming building, this hall was chosen mostly for its strategic location. Nestled on the eastern edge of the inner court, it afforded easy access to both the women's quarters to the west and north, as well as to the grand halls of the outer court to the southeast. These destinations were served by 3 gates, each with a very specific purpose. One southern gate led to the outer court and the formal business of the empire, which we'll see in a second. 2 northern gates, however, granted access to the women's quarters. One to the Empress Dowager, and one to the Emperor's consorts. These separate passageways were purposely segregated so that the Empress Dowager could not keep tabs on which consort the Emperor had chosen to favor. Now I think we're ready to walk in the footsteps of the Emperor himself. Let's recreate a day in the life of one of the longest reigning emperors in Chinese history, the Qin Long Emperor, who ruled more than 60 years from the 1730s to the 1790s. On any given day, he likely would have woken up around 4 in the morning, after having spent the night alone in his bed. Any consort or concubine he had chosen to spend the previous evening with would have returned to her own quarters before bedtime. Once awake, the emperor lit a candle. This was the signal to the eunuchs outside that the curfew had ended and that the emperor was ready for a tub of hot water. After cleaning himself up, the emperor made his first stop at the Palace of Earthly Tranquility. After listening to the shamanic dirges and witnessing the roasting of a boar, he was carried in a sedan chair to the west flourishing gate in the far southwestern corner of the palace. Here he exited the Forbidden City and entered what are today known as the Lake Palaces. First built by the Mongol Yuan dynasty in the 13th century, the Lake Palaces are a series of pavilions and halls situated along the scenic shores of Zhongnanhai, the central and southern lakes. Here, in the studio of convivial delights, Qianlong ate his breakfast, some 18 dishes spread out over 4 tables, with 4 eunuchs attending to his every need. After breakfast, the rest of the day was devoted to work. First, the emperor would probably return to the Hall of Mental Cultivation or the Palace of Heavenly Purity in the inner court, where he would read government documents and meet with his top military and civil officials. But sooner or later, he would make his way to the Hall of Supreme Harmony in the outer court. This is where the formal and most solemn business of the empire took place. With the largest dimensions of any building in the empire, the Hall of Supreme Harmony is the most impressive and imposing structure in the Forbidden City. It stands about 114 feet tall and spans a width of nearly 200 feet. Along with 2 other smaller halls behind it, the Hall of Supreme Harmony sits on a 3-tiered marble platform that symbolizes Mount Sumeru, the Buddhist mountain at the center of the cosmos. But the emperor had his own special stairway for this platform, one that only he could cross over in a sedan chair. Known as the Cinnabar Stairway, it is a single block of inclined marble that weighs 250 tons. Carvings of dragons playing with pearls decorate its surface. Scholars estimate that nearly 6,000 soldiers and 10,000 laborers were required to transport this slab of marble from a quarry about 30 miles away. Now, the Hall of Supreme Harmony was the primary venue for all major imperial rituals and ceremonies. These included the emperor's birthday, his enthronement, audiences with foreign delegations, and the final round of the civil service examination. The setting was ideal for mass assembly. The courtyard just south of the Hall of Supreme Harmony covers 7.5 acres, or just a little more than 2 baseball fields. But the Hall of Supreme Harmony, while impressive, is not the only building in this courtyard. Immediately behind it to the north is the smaller Hall of Central Harmony, where the emperor could rest or change his clothing between audiences. And behind that is the somewhat larger Hall of Preserved Harmony, which hosted large banquets for foreign dignitaries and various other celebrations. Sometime in the late afternoon or early evening, the never-ending business of tending to the empire finally came to an end. When the workday was over, the emperor would likely retire to one of his pleasure gardens back inside the inner court. We know that the Qin Long Emperor favored the Studio of Exhausted Diligence in the northeastern corner. The name of the garden says it all. This is where you go after a long day of exhausting diligence at work. This particular garden complex has been extensively renovated in recent years, so it gives visitors a pretty good idea of how the emperor spent his leisure hours. It includes picturesque pavilions, man-made ponds, manicured trees and hills, and even an indoor theater. But we're going to pretend that today is a special day. So we're not going to let Qianlong retire to his gardens. For on March 12th, 1760, there was still some state business he had to attend to. That was the day when Qianlong reviewed a parade of soldiers who had just returned from a grand military conquest on the northwestern frontiers of the empire. The preferred staging grounds for such occasions was just south of the Meridian Gate. Now the starting point for most tourists who enter the complex, the Meridian Gate is actually the tallest structure in the Forbidden City, with 3 passageways at ground level. On this particular day, Qianlong would have assumed his place at the center of the parapets on top of the gate and taken in the sight below. His troops had just returned from the Muslim lands of Central Asia, and placed by the emperor's side was a casket containing 2 left ears of the final Muslim belligerents. And with these grisly trophies in hand, Qianlong could finally retire to the inner court, having unknowingly laid the foundations for the modern-day boundaries of the People's Republic of China. The 20th century was not kind to the Forbidden City. In the year 1900, it was invaded and plundered by 8 foreign empires who auctioned off many of its treasures. After the 1911 revolution and abdication of the last Qing emperor, most modern Chinese statesmen viewed it as an unwelcome reminder of feudal China and the political and cultural stagnation that they blamed for China's repeated defeats at the hands of foreign powers. After the Chinese Communists came to power in 1949, Chairman Mao even considered various proposals to demolish the Forbidden City and replace it with modern highways or Stalinist-style architecture. But none of these rulers could ever quite bring themselves to tear its ancient buildings down. Instead, China's new leaders took up residence in Zhongnanhai, or the lake palaces located just outside the western walls where the Qianlong Emperor used to eat his daily breakfast. Today, Zhongnanhai is practically a synonym for the highest levels of Communist Party leadership. This seems to be a metaphor for China's newfound embrace of its imperial past. Wary of following directly in the footsteps of the emperors, they instead founded new organs of government in the shadow of their greatest imperial palace. Today, the Forbidden City is a national museum. As such, it serves a very different purpose than before. That is, once quite literally forbidden to the Chinese people, today the Forbidden City is held up as the very emblem of the Chinese nation itself. No doubt the Qianlong Emperor is rolling in his grave. But such is the inevitable fate of any building that manages to survive 2 dynasties, endless wars, a host of termites, endless roasting of boars, and a communist revolution. To paraphrase the emperor's eunuchs when they greeted him each morning, "Long live the Forbidden City."